Shalom, Hovering. James Trim here. And today I want to talk to you about some really special things, amazing things that are happening in the restoration of the ancient sect of Nazarene Judaism, the original Jewish followers of Yeshua as the Messiah. Now, in the Second Temple era, the different sects of the different sects of Judaism tended to have specialized in different areas. Um, the Pharisees had really concentrated on and specialized in Halacha. Halacha is a word meaning the way we walk, basically. It's from the verb to walk, to go, the way we go. It means the way that how we observe Torah, the way that we observe the Torah. For example, the Torah says you will not go out of your place on Shabbat. What does that mean? What constitutes our place? The Torah says not to do work on the Shabbat. What constitutes work, etc. So these are the kinds of issues that are dealt with in the field of halakha. And then the Essenes tended to concentrate on mysticism and prophecy, and the Hellenists tended to concentrate on philosophy. None of these areas are wrong. The Sadducees I won't even mention because they were just too far off. But the field of halakha is very necessary if you're going to have a Torah community, if you're going to engage in Torah observance. You have to know how to observe Torah, and it's not just as simple as opening up the Torah and reading it, as the Sadducees might, or the modern Kairites might have you believe. There are simply matters that come up that are not adequately dealt with simply by looking at the written text of the Torah. In Rabbinic Judaism, there are some major texts on standard texts on halakha. Apart from the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, which is difficult to read in the sense that, well, first of all, it's like a set of encyclopedias. It's long. If you study a page of Talmud a year, it would take 7 years to study the entire Talmud. And that's studying through a page of Talmud a year is a remarkable pace at studying Talmud. There is a system that's been laid out to go through the Talmud and study the entire Talmud over 7 years, studying a page a day. And I can tell you those Talmud classes are moving at a rocket pace to cover through an entire page of Talmud in a single class. So Talmud is sort of a lifetime study. And so studying the halakha and codifying it simply from the Talmud itself, because the Talmud will open up a topic and explore that topic, and it includes the majority and minority opinions, and sometimes it will adopt a proposal or engage in the quest of what a certain proposal made by a certain rabbi, what all of its ramifications would mean, and it may go on for several pages discussing all the ramifications of that particular view, only to ultimately decide that it's a incorrect view. It's kind of like the Supreme Court record with all the dissenting views included. However, that's not necessarily what you want if you just want to study the Halacha. Uh, and so there's a text that's used uh, in the Ashkenazi community, which is the Mishnah, uh, the Mishnah Torah is what it's called by Rambam Maimonides. There's also a text called the that's used in the Sephardic tradition called Shulchan Aruch, and there's a modification of the Shulchan Aruch that's also used in the Ashkenazi community. But what we don't have really is a halakhic text of this caliber for Nazarene Judaism. And that's a shame because, believe it or not, there's a great deal of halakhic information in the Ketuvim Netzarim, in the writings of the Nazarenes. And there's a great deal of principles given from which explain how those halachot were derived that can be used to address issues that are not directly addressed in the Ketuvim Netzarim, the writings of the Nazarenes. And so it came apparent to me that it was incumbent upon me to compose such a codification of Nazarene Halakha. Why me? Because I've been studying the issue for over 35 years, maybe 40 years, because I'm a student of Talmud, and because I've well read in the underlying matters, if you will. And unlike many in Rabbinic Judaism, I've also made a study of the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and from Josephus and Philo, and from the Dead Sea Scrolls, some study of what the Essene halachot were. And I'm also read in the writings of Philo of Alexandria and Josephus in general, which can have some contribution to the matter. So, as Hillel says, if you can't find the man, be the man. So, not able to find a Nazarene version, if you will, of the Shulchan Aruch, and being able to compose one myself, and not knowing anyone else, frankly, that is capable of doing so, I felt it was my obligation to the restoration of Nazarene Judaism to do so. And so I started that work. And usually with these videos, we have handouts. There were this time we're not going to have a handout. There will be a link. I am composing this work online free. It is called the Haderek Laleket, the Haderek Laleket, which is Hebrew for the way to walk. And you can go to nazarenespace.com/blog, and I'll put the link down at the bottom of the video once it's uploaded in the comments, in the description. But you can go there, and in the right-hand column, down in the section labeled More, the fourth item down is Haderek Laleket, Systematic Halacha. You click on that link, it will take you to a page which I've begun to compose. I had some very exciting breakthroughs in the last few days in working on the codification and clarifying thoughts. Things crystallized and became very clear that clarified issues about which I myself wasn't clear about a week ago. So I want to kind of share with you some of this information. I have completed the part one. I've divided this work into two parts. Part one is midot, which are, in this case, principles, rules. These are methods that we see Yeshua using in formulating halachot and information he gives us about, in general, about halachot that allow us to see how the sausage is made, as the old saying goes, only it's not necessarily an unpleasant thing like that saying refers to see how it's done. And then once you see how it's done enough times, through enough examples, then we're ready to implement those principles on matters that Yeshua didn't directly address. So let's begin with the part one, midot principles. Part one is all I've completed so far. Part two will probably take months or years, because part two will address various issues of Halacha and develop a systematic codified Nazarene Halacha. So if we begin let's begin with Matthew 23:23, which is the passage that really was a breakthrough. Matthew 23:23. The reason I say it was a breakthrough is I was aware of the passage, and I had used it as a quote-unquote proof text, if you will, for the idea that certain matters of Halacha, of Torah, have greater weight than others. This section, by the way, is titled Kol Vechomer, which is one of the rules of Hillel, light and heavy. Usually it's used for interpretation of texts. In this case, we're using it halachically to refer to the weight of different commandments. Some of this information, though, in these conclusions, Kol Vechomer halachic conclusions, may result from application of Kol Vechomer reasoning and Kol Vechomer interpretation of the text. These principles I'm laying out are not hermeneutic principles as such. I will make use of hermeneutic principles that are not delineated here. Either I'll include an appendix on that, or there'll simply be another work on it, or simply direction where you can learn some of these 7 rules of Hillel, 13 rules of Ishmael, 32 rules of Eliezer, etc. So the passage that was such the breakthrough was Matthew 23:23, and I'll just be quoting a portion of it. It says, "Those things which are weightiest in the Torah," and he says, "judgment, loving kindness, and faith." Different translations may have different things here, but what I found, I wanted to get pull the word for weightiest, which is homerim, which is in keeping with kol vechomer, light and heavy. So the heaviest or weightiest things in the Torah. So I went to this passage in Deuteronomy, to the Deuteronomy Hebrew text of Matthew, to derive and cite that word, because I wanted to show that Yeshua agrees with this idea that some commandments, some mitzvot, are weightier than others. And then I thought, well, since I'm pulling that technical term, let's look very carefully at the Hebrew words that are used for judgment, loving kindness, and faith. And what I found was very exciting, because there are actually some very key words here. We're going to find out why later in the study as we continue. But the words are, for judgment is mishpat. The word for loving kindness is chesed. And the word for faith is emunah. Some will have truth there, I think, but really the word emunah means faith, and the word emet means truth, if we want to interpret very strictly. These are really key terms that unlock a lot of information about Nazarene Halacha to us, Yeshua's Halacha. But and we're going to get there as the study moves forward. But the point here is that sometimes one has to violate one Torah command in order to keep another. Violate is I'm using for the time being is, for want of a better term, actually the commandment is what we call loosed when this happens. That commandment is loosed in order to keep one of higher priority. For example, classic example that I've used many times, someone is fallen off of a ship and they're drowning, and I see them in the water drowning, and I turn around and I grab a life preserver from the wall of the ship behind me that says SS, whatever the ship's name is, and I grab the life preserver and I'm about to throw it overboard to help them and save them. And someone comes up behind me and says, "Oh, no, this is my ship. That's my life preserver. You can't use it." And so I have a dilemma. Do I violate the Torah commandment effectively against murder by murdering this person that I can have the opportunity to rescue? Or do I violate the commandment against theft by taking the life preserver that is someone else's property that's been prohibited to me? And of course, the answer, all of us would agree, recognize immediately, is that we would use the life preserver and save the person's life, even though doing so would require an act of theft. There are classic examples of this issue that come up in Torah on a regular basis. One of the most immediate ones, and that's here in our text as we move forward in the section on midot here, which are the principles that we derive. The Torah requires every male child to be circumcised on the 8th day, Leviticus 12:3. Elsewhere, the Torah requires us not to rest from, quote, work on the Sabbath, Exodus 28-11. So this creates a dilemma. One child in 7 is going to have their 8th day circumcision appointment fall on the Sabbath. Do we use tools and work on the Sabbath to perform the circumcision, or do we violate the commandment against circumcising on the 8th day by putting it off till the 9th day because it's the Sabbath? This is an issue that Yeshua addressed in Yochanan chapter 7, verses 22-23. He says, "Because of this, Moshe gave you circumcision, not because it was from the fathers, and on the Sabbath you circumcise a man. If a man is circumcised on the Sabbath, on the day of the Sabbath, that the Torah of Moshe be not loosed, do you murmur against me because I have healed the whole man on the day of the Sabbath?" So here what Yeshua is saying is, he's addressing the very dilemma. And he's saying, no, we do perform the circumcision on the Sabbath. That's what we do. The Sabbath, the commandment to circumcise on the 8th day outweighs the commandment to keep the Sabbath. This commandment this dilemma is also addressed in the Gemara in the Babylonian Talmud Yoma 85b. Rabbi Eliezer addressed and said, if circumcision, which attaches to one only of the 248 members of the human body, suspends the Sabbath, how much more shall the saving of the whole body suspend the Sabbath? You may notice that that's very close to what Yeshua said in Yochanan 7. And this is pointing back to a decision that is laid out in the Mishnah, in Mishnah Shabbat 18, chapter 18, section 1, which is also in the Babylonian Talmud in Shabbat 128b. It says, all the requirements of the circumcision may be done on the Sabbath. So so here we have a dilemma. Do we keep the circumcision on the 8th day or the Sabbath? Can't do both. Got to do one or the other. Which one is weightier? And so here we have a good example of a dilemma of this sort. And Halacha is the resolution to the dilemma, because with the written Torah alone, you don't know which one do I keep. I don't know which one to keep and which one to violate. Matthew chapter 12, verses 5 through 7 gives us another example. Here Yeshua says, have you not read in the Torah that the Kohanim profane the Sabbath in the temple and are blameless? But I tell you, there is greater than the temple, that here is greater than the temple. And if you had known what it means, for I desire mercy and not sacrifice, quoting Hosea 6:6, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So here's another halakhic issue. We have the daily burnt offerings. We have the 2 sacrifices every day. And the Torah specifically tells us about making burnt offerings on the Sabbath. And yet, the Sabbath is supposed to be the day of rest. Why are the priests working? And even if they are working, why are they burning anything? Because specific in the Torah commands concerning the Sabbath are not to cause anything to burn, not to combust anything. And that's exactly what's happening with the burnt offering. So why is this taking place? And what it means is that we have another dilemma. Do we keep the commandment to do burnt offerings on the Sabbath and to have all these ceremonies, priestly ceremonies taking place on the Sabbath? Or do we keep the commandment to rest on the Sabbath? Which one do we do? And Yeshua says the priests, they're working on the Sabbath and they're burning these things, they're doing burnt offerings even on the Sabbath, and they are blameless. In other words, the burnt offerings and the sacrifices outweigh the Sabbath. Now, Yeshua is quoting here from Hosea 6:6. And if we look up Hosea 6:6, we read, for I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of Elohim rather than burnt offerings. So Hosea 6:6, the word for mercy there is chesed. That's a very important word. Remember in Matthew 23:23, at the beginning of this teaching, Yeshua said that one of the 3 weightiest matters of Torah is chesed. And here we run into it again, for I desire chesed and not sacrifice. Chesed outweighs the sacrifices. And in poetic parallelism, Yeshua doesn't mention this part, but if we look at Hosea 6:6, it's written in poetic parallelism, and the parallel passage says, and the knowledge of Elohim rather than burnt offerings. So the mercy here is the chesed, which is the Hebrew means mercy, loving kindness, undue favor, grace, all these things, okay? Now I want to talk about the 2 weightiest commandments, because Yeshua gives us a big clue in understanding the weight of the mitzvot, because he tells us which ones are the top 2. In Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40, it says, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment in the Torah? Now, if you look at the context of this, it's a Pharisee that's asking him this, and he says, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment in the Torah? And Yeshua answered and said, you shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your nefesh, your soul, your might, and with all your might, sorry. This is the greatest commandment in the whole Torah. And this is the first, but the second is like it, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus 19:18. So the number one commandment, the weightiest commandment in the whole Torah, is Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second runner-up, silver medal mitzvah, is to love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the Torah and the prophets. Now, if we that's Matthew 22 verses 36 through 40. If we go to Mark's account of the same events, he continues the story. He continues this account, including information that Matthew didn't include. I started with Matthew because I like Matthew, and we have Matthew in Hebrew, and because the Gospel according to the Hebrews is Matthew's actually a condensed version of it, or an abridged version of it, and because Matthew mentioned that this guy was a Pharisee, although I didn't include that in the quote. In Mark, it only says that he was a scribe. In Mark chapter 12, verses 32 through 33, we have the additional information. And the scribe said to him, Yeshua, good, Rabbi. Good, I agree with you. In other words, Yeshua's halacha is not that different from Pharisaic halacha. And this guy is agreeing with him on these first two commandments. Halacha was still very fluid in the Second Temple era. This isn't necessarily reflective of the position of rabbinic halacha today. But he says, good, Rabbi, you have said the truth, for he is one, and there are others apart from him, referring to Deuteronomy 6:4, and then going into, and that a man should love him with all the heart, with all the entire mind, and with all the nefesh, and with all the might, is Deuteronomy 6:5. And that he should love his neighbor as himself, Leviticus 19:18. Okay, so here he's referencing the same two mitzvot. But then he says something else. He says, greater is this than all the offerings and the sacrifices. This is referencing Hosea 6:6. Some versions say burnt offerings here and sacrifices. Here he's referencing Hosea 6:6, which is the passage that Yeshua was using when he was arguing in Matthew 12 that chesed outweighs the burnt offerings, or actually the sacrifices, and therefore chesed must also outweigh the Sabbath, because the Sabbath outweighs the burnt offerings outweigh the Sabbath. Okay, so the sacrifices do. And Yeshua agrees with him in verse 34, which is also very important. It means that we can therefore be confident in using this Pharisee's opinion in verses 32 and 33. Yeshua saw that he answered the matter wisely, and he answered and said to him, you are not far from the kingdom of Elohim, and no man dared to ask him again. So here we have an understanding of where Hosea 6:6 is drawing the chesed and the knowledge of Elohim from. Here we learn that the two commandments, love Yahweh in Deuteronomy 6:5 and love your neighbor in Leviticus 19:18, are parallel to the two passages in Hosea 6:6. That chesed, loving kindness, corresponds to love your neighbor, and the knowledge of Elohim, also in Hosea 6:6, corresponds to love Yahweh in Deuteronomy 6:5. So this is important because Hosea doesn't get to make up Torah. Hosea only gets to comment upon Torah, and so elaborate on Torah, but he doesn't get to make up fresh Torah. So Hosea is referring back to these first highest priority two commandments. When he refers to chesed, he's referring to love your neighbor, And when he refers to the knowledge of Elohim, he's referring to love Yahweh with all your heart, with all your soul, in Deuteronomy 6:4 or 6:5. Sorry. This brings us back to Matthew 23:23. It gives us another important clue. When Yeshua references judgment, loving kindness, and faith, these three weightiest matters of the Torah, he's revealed to us a further, deeper understanding. And this is the revelation that I received just in the last 2 or 3 days, and I frantically had to write this all up and present it to you because it's so important. Here, okay, so here, loving kindness is chesed, which is love your neighbor, and then faith is emunah, which corresponds to love Yahweh, Deuteronomy 6:5, and the knowledge of Elohim, which are the two greatest commandments. But here in Matthew 23:23, we get a third matter of Torah, which is very important because we know which ones are the first two, and now we have the three weightiest commandments. So by process of elimination, the third of those will be the next runner-up, number 3 in our progression, right? And so the next runner-up, the third weightiest matter in Torah, is what it calls judgment in our English, but in the Hebrew it's mishpat. So now it's important to know that there are 3 classes of commandments in the Torah. And we read about these in the Torah, in that the Torah will sometimes mention, the different translations will have it differently, but the judgments, the testimonies, and the statutes. The judgments are the mishpatim, which is plural for mishpat. The mishpatim. The testimonies are the edot, and the statutes are the hukim. So what is the difference between the judgments, the testimonies, and the statutes? What are these 3 different kinds of mitzvot, or commandments? Well, let's start with the mishpatim. The mishpatim are commandments that regulate the relationships between people. They're precepts of civilization. They're the things that we need to be able to, can't we all just get along? And they're designed to keep us from killing each other and breaking each other's stuff. So they're the mishpatim. They're the types of laws that men tend to realize that we need to have a civilization and get along with each other, even if we had not received them in the Torah. We would figure out, we got to have a law against theft because I don't want anybody stealing my stuff and you don't want anybody stealing yours, and so we need a law against theft. We need a law against murder because I don't want to get killed and neither do you. And so these are the basic kinds of laws that are no-brainers, if you will. The mishpatim. The edot are commandments that testify in some way to Elohim, in that they remind us of events or concepts. They're tokens, if you will. These include the Sabbath is a good example. The appointed times of the feasts, the Jewish holidays, if you will, the ones of the Torah at least. The mezuzah, the tefillin, the commandment to lay the tefillin. These are the kinds of things that are symbolic tokens that teach us and testify to certain realities, perhaps abstract realities, and yet they are not the sorts of commandments that we would come up with on our own if we hadn't received the Torah. But having received the Torah and having these commandments, we can examine them and see that uh, they have some symbolic meaning that we can conceive. That circumcision, for example, that is a token of the covenant, um, that testify to Elohim. They're comprehensible, but they're not, they're comprehensible. They're understandable, but they're not things that we would have come up with on our own without the Torah. Finally, we have the chukim. The chukim are the statutes. And these are the commandments that the human mind finds difficult to understand. We don't necessarily comprehend them. Um, why do we do them? Because Daddy said to. Because because Elohim told us to. Um, but we can't comprehend the rationale behind them, really. Um, if we can, it's very difficult and strained. It's not, there's no surface understanding to them. Some of these would be, for example, the commandment not to mix wool with linen. And yeah, you can come up with some kind of a teaching or some kind of a symbolism behind it, but there's nothing readily apparent. Not only would we not come up with these mitzvot on our own had we not received the Torah, even having received them, we're kind of like, huh? All right, if you say so, because they're statutes, they're uh, they're decrees from Elohim. He said so. Therefore, he said it. I'll do it. And so this is, like I said, not to mix wool and linen in our garments, and also the kosher laws fall under this because, yeah, some people will write articles and come up with ideas about why the kosher laws are there. Maybe they're there for our health, but we wouldn't have come up with them by ourselves as such. And while we may theorize that they were given for this or that reason, the Torah only tells us that they were given to make us a holy and separate people, which is not especially helpful in trying to understand their meaning. Um, Again, we can assign some abstract meaning, but it's really difficult to comprehend it. So these are the chukim. So Matthew 23:23 is telling us that immediately after the first two greatest commandments in weight, the third weightiest matter of the Torah are the mishpatim. They have the next highest priority. So first we have love Yahweh, your Elohim, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, i.e. faith, emunah, trusting faithfulness, or the knowledge of Elohim as we read in Hosea 6:6. Emunah as we read in Matthew 23:23. The second weightiest matter of the Torah is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19:18, which is chesed, loving kindness, in Matthew 23:23 and in Hosea 6:6. And then we get to the third weightiest matter in the Torah, and the third weightiest matter in the Torah, next runner-up, is the mishpatim, the commandments that we just discussed that we would have probably formulated for ourselves even if we hadn't received the Torah, that deal with our human relationships with each other and maintaining a civilization. Those are the next runner-up. Now, we're not specifically told, but now we have a pattern that we can follow, and the pattern seems to unfold quite neatly with the fourth, then, matter of Torah being the edot. The edot being the mitzvot that are testimonies, tokens. And then the fifth runner-up are the chukim, the matters of Torah for which we really can't understand and don't have any rationale, but Elohim said so. So within these categories, there is also the potential for tension, because although we may now have a principle and a rule for matters of one category superseding matters of another category, for example, uh, uh, matters of chesed and therefore loving your neighbor superseding matters of the Sabbath, which is in the fourth category, edot, so that we perform healings on the Sabbath, we do good deeds on the Sabbath. Um, so we can determine that pretty easy, but we may have issues that come up within a category. For example, within the edot, we have both circumcision and Sabbath. Fortunately, Yeshua has told us that the circumcision outweighs the Sabbath, so we have a rule. Another example is the sacrifices and burnt offerings, and again, we have a rule that they outweigh the Sabbath. That they're of greater weight than the Sabbath, even though they're all edot, they're all in the fourth category. However, matters of the second category, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, always outweigh matters of the fourth category, and so on. So another example of matters that are all within the Mishpatim is addressed in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 9, that the commandment to honor our parents outweighs the commandment to keep our vows. We have a related principle that really kind of falls broadly under this category of weight. It's called pikuach nefesh, guarding the nefesh, guarding the soul, or guarding the life. This is the principle of Halacha that the preservation of human life overrides virtually any other mitzvah. I said virtually. It doesn't override, well, we'll get to that in a minute. It's implicit in the second greatest commandment, the second weightiest matter in the Torah, love your neighbor as yourself. The Torah teaches us in Leviticus 18:5, you shall keep my commandments, or my statutes and my laws, which a person shall do and shall live by them. I am Yahweh. So the mitzvot were intended for us to live, not to die. And a remez of this verse is that the Torah is intended for life. Remez is we talked many times before about the four levels of understanding. The Peshat, the Remez, the Drash, the Sod. The Peshat is the literal meaning. The Remez is the implied meaning. And the Drash is the allegorical or homiletical meaning, and the Sod is the mystical, hidden, secret meaning. And here, the Remez, the implication of this verse, is that the Torah is intended for life. And any application of the Torah that fosters death, that brings about death, is not the intended application of the Torah as a rule. And this is why the prophet says in Ezekiel 20, verse 11, I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them, not die in them. There are exceptions to this principle. One may not commit murder to save another life, because it doesn't make any sense to kill one life to save another. There's no net gain there. One may not violate the greatest commandment, which is to love Yahweh, and that would include acts of blasphemy or idolatry. So that's off the table. We don't do that. And certain acts of forbidden sexual relations are also not loosed under this principle, because the sexual act, the reproductive act, is a picture of the male and female image of Elohim, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 27. So acts that deface the image of Elohim are thus violations of the weightiest commandment, and therefore it is not loosed for this reason. So this really is implicit under the previous category, and I state it because it gives us additional proof texts, if you will, and additional reasoning to back up uh, what was said before. But really, we wouldn't even need this principle if we properly apply the principles of weight. This is more a corollary, if you will, from the principles of weight that we've already discussed. So is the next section I have here, techit chesed, which is under grace. It's a term that Paul uses in contrast to under Torah, which is under the law, which was the position of the Essenes, that man was subservient to the Torah. And we can derive this from a teaching that Yeshua gives in Mark 2:27. He says, "And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for a son of man, and not a son of man for the Sabbath. Thus also the Son of Man is the Adonai of the Sabbath." There's a similar teaching found in the Talmud by Rabbi Jonathan ben Joseph, and this similar statement gives us the advantage of citing the Torah basis for the teaching. Rabbi Josh, this is Babylonian Talmud Yoma 85b. Rabbi Joshua ben Yosef says, "For it is holy unto you," speaking of the Sabbath in Exodus chapter 30, verse 22, and Exodus 31:14. "It, the Sabbath, is committed to your hands, not you to its hands." Now, if you know anything about Hebrew, when it says in Exodus 30:22 and 31:14 that the Sabbath is holy unto you, it uses the lamed preposition, which is an inseparable preposition that attaches as a prefix onto a word, onto a pronoun or a noun. For it is holy unto you. So it's all this word, this preposition in Hebrew. This is also the way that you designate possession in Hebrew. For example, in Hebrew, I would say that if I was going to say that this book is Yosef's, I would say to Yosef is this book, or this book is to Yosef. And if I was going to say the book is mine, I'd say this book is to me. Okay. So there is this linguistic implication in the original Hebrew of these passages of Exodus that the Sabbath belongs to us. We don't belong to the Sabbath. We have ownership of it. It has been committed into our hands, and it was made for us. We weren't made for it, which is the opposite of the under the law position of the Essenes. The Essenes maintained instead that it was more important to observe the Sabbath than save a human life or anything else. That we were less important than the Sabbath. We were a lower priority. You see how these all fit together. They're not. These principles I'm showing you. These three principles I've shown you so far. These first three principles, they blur together because these last two are really corollaries of the first one. Okay. We read the same thing about the Jubilee year in Leviticus 25:12, that it is holy to you. And so we can derive from this, there's a principle in the rules of Hillel, building a rule from two passages. We can generalize now and say that the Torah, therefore, was committed to us, and we weren't committed to the Torah. Therefore, we are above. We are not under the Torah. The Torah is under us. We are under chesed. We are under grace. We are under loving kindness. And so this is basically bringing us back to our kol vechomer principle. So these last two principles, techit chesed and pikuach nefesh, are in fact extensions of the kol vechomer principle. This is, by the way, why, as I said, Paul talks about being under grace and not under the Torah. It has nothing to do with abolishing the Torah. In previous studies, we have already covered Yesod HaBriah, which is essentially, it's the Yesod HaBriyah is the uh, principle of creation. It's the intent of nature. It's Elohim's intent for us, which is impressed. I may do a whole video about this sometime, but it's Elohim's intention for us that is impressed into the universe itself and may be observed by us, and that Yesod HaBriyah, the principle of creation, is an important element for developing Halacha. Again, that may be a whole video at some point. I've addressed it in the past. And then we have a Gezira, which is a Gezira. Anciently, it was just a tradition, but it came to refer specifically to traditions that are a hedge that is built around the Torah. We did it. We've addressed this before, and so I'm not going to address it again, other than to say that in the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua gives us 6 examples where he builds a fence around the Torah to protect the actual Torah from violation. So if the Torah says be in by 11, rather than trying to time ourselves, it's like you're going to an event, and the event starts at 11. You can time yourself to show up right there on the dot at 11, but if you do, you run the risk of running late and getting there after 11. But if you try and get there at 10:45, which is what most of us do, and get there, 15 minutes early or half hour early or whatever, then if we run late, we still can get there on time. And so that's the principle of the Yesod HaBriyah. They protect us from violating the actual Torah. I will just breeze over some of these real quickly. The first one is making a fence around murder. And Yeshua says, hey, you shouldn't murder, but you really shouldn't hate your brother or be angry with your brother. And if you can keep from being angry with your brother, you're very unlikely to kill him. You're very unlikely to get to engage in a crime of passion and kill him. So let's just not get angry at him or foster anger in him toward him. Adultery, Yeshua says, hey, don't even look at that married woman with lust in your eye. Making a fence around divorce, Yeshua gives the widest possible application and says that we don't. The only reason for the divorce is if the woman engages in adultery, in fornication. Then we make a fence around vows. We'll be doing a whole study on vows soon in the Halacha of Yeshua, but the thing here is Yeshua says, hey, the Torah says not to violate your vows, to keep your vows, so that you don't have to worry about violating your vows. Just don't make them. Just don't make any vows. Then you don't have to worry about violating them. Then making a fence around liability in Matthew 5:38 through 42. That has to do with civil liability, and basically saying if you have a civil liability, pay more than your liability is. So that, again, if you're aiming right at exactly what, for example, if I total somebody's car and I'm liable for the cost of their car, that if I am just aiming at covering the value of their car, maybe I make a mistake. Maybe it's not quite enough. Maybe I haven't met my actual liability. But if I give them something extra, then I make sure that I've more than covered. In other words, he says, don't cover your liability, more than cover your liability. Okay. And then love your neighbor, and so that we'll do a whole teaching on this in the future. Yeshua's teaching basically is that if you love your neighbor, to love your neighbor, we build a fence around the word neighbor. Since you don't know who your neighbor is, sometimes you're mistaken as to who your friends are. The the best policy is simply to love everyone as yourself, regardless of whether they're your neighbor or your friend, because you don't know who your real friends are and who your real neighbors are. You may think you know, but you may be mistaken. You may have friends that you know not who are, and you may have, conversely, sadly, you may have people that you think are your friends that are not. But nonetheless, uh, to uh, uh, to protect the Torah, we apply this to everyone. Okay. Um, so that's the end of part one, and that's the foundation for formulating halachot in the future. I hope this has been a helpful study for you, and please help us by donating to this work. Not just this work, but the all-inclusive work that we're doing. For those that don't know, real briefly, keep this simple. My wife's disabled. She's chronically ill, and she suffers from chronic pain. She's I'm her caretaker, and so we need your help in 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 that regard, in the form of tzedakah alms, and we would also appreciate your help in the form of tithes and offerings to support this ministry work that I do, primarily from a desk about 6 feet away uh, from her bed, and is where I'm normally working. So anyway, I just want to please ask you to strongly consider. Uh, our rent will be due before too long. Our car payment's about to hit over this weekend. We always need your financial support, and um, it's a mitzvah for you. So uh, just you can send donations by PayPal to donations at wnae.org. That's W is in world, N is in Nazarene, A is in assembly, E is in Elohim. WNAE.org, donations at WNAE.org. All right. So I'll also put that in the information down at the bottom of this video. Okay. So please donate, donate, donate. You make this work possible. I can't do it alone. Shalom, everybody.